November 1883, the eastern approach to Crow Creek Pass, Montana. The stagecoach went over on the second bend, which was, it should be noted, the bend the driver had been watching since the previous town and had told himself was manageable, in the way that people tell themselves things are manageable when the only alternative to believing it is to stop moving entirely. The left rear wheel found an ice shelf beneath 3 inches of fresh snow. What happened next was not complicated. The coach was heavy, the grade was steep, and the wheel lost its argument with the ice shelf in the span of about 4 seconds. Clara Holt went from being a woman on her way to her sister's homestead in Billings to being a woman in a snowdrift 12 feet below the road with a bruised shoulder and a very strong opinion about the month of November. The other 2 passengers had been on the uphill side of the coach when it went. They were shaken, but standing. The driver was already on the road assessing things with the expression of a man who knows the situation is beyond what he can assess. The horses were alive but not useful in any immediate sense. The nearest town was 6 miles back, he called down, and the storm that had been building since noon had stopped making decisions and committed to a direction. Clara sat in the snowdrift and took stock. Left shoulder, sore but functional. Hat, gone. Bag, somewhere in the snow to her right. Sister's homestead, still 90 miles away, and now requiring an entirely different arrangement than the one she had made this morning. The temperature was dropping at a rate that made it clear the evening intended to have opinions about women who sat in snowdrifts, taking stock instead of moving. She stood up. She started moving. She had gotten approximately 40 feet from the wreckage, in a direction she was mostly confident was not deeper into the mountains, when something very large stepped out of the tree line 10 feet in front of her and stopped. Clara Holt was not what anyone would have described as a woman who frightened easily. She had grown up in St. Louis and come west twice before this, and had developed the practical confidence of a person who generally believes she can handle what is in front of her because, so far, she generally has. She was 32 years old, and her record on this was good. What stepped out of the tree line was, by any reasonable measure, a great deal to have in front of you at dusk in a snowstorm. He was enormous in the way that certain men are enormous, not heavy, but simply large in every direction. Built like something the mountains had taken a particular interest in producing. He wore working furs that had been working furs long enough to become the color of the terrain around them. He carried a wood axe in one hand with the casualness of something that weighed about as much as a coffee cup. He had a beard that appeared to have been growing since some time before Clara was born, and he was staring at her with the expression of a man who has just encountered the single thing he had not prepared for, which, in his case, was a woman. He looked at her. He looked at the wrecked stagecoach on the road above. He looked back at her. He appeared to be working through something with more deliberateness than the temperature permitted. He said, "Are you hurt?" He said this to a point approximately 2 feet to the left of her actual head. She said, "My shoulder, not badly." He nodded, still addressing the air beside her. He seemed to be arriving at a decision through a process that involved more stages than the situation strictly called for. He said, "I have a cabin, less than a mile." He paused. "You could come there." He delivered this with the air of a man making an offer he fully expected to be declined and had already arranged himself for the declining. She looked at the snowdrift. She looked at the sky, which was making its intentions clear. She looked back at the very large man who was looking at everything except her. She said, "All right." He turned and walked into the trees. She followed. He said nothing for the entire walk to the cabin, which was 20 minutes through snow now coming in the horizontal way. That means a storm has committed to its purpose. He walked ahead and occasionally glanced back to confirm she was still there, each time making eye contact for approximately half a second before finding something in the middle distance to look at instead. This happened 5 times. She counted. The cabin was single room and had been built by someone who understood what single room meant in terms of what you included and what you were strategic about. It was small enough that a man of his dimensions occupied a notable percentage of its available space just by standing in it. There was a bed against the right wall, a wood stove in the center, a table with 2 chairs, a collection of shelves organized with the specific logic of a person who had been the only person consulting them for a very long time, and approximately the amount of floor space that remained after all of the above. He set her bag down beside the door. She had not seen him retrieve it from the wreckage, but he had. He went to the stove and got the fire going with the efficiency of someone who has done this particular thing thousands of times under every possible condition. He did not look at her while he did this. Clara stood inside the door and looked at the room and understood the geometry of what she had walked into. She said, "I can take the chair by the stove. You don't need to give up your bed." He said, "Take the bed. It's warmer." She started to argue. He placed a second log on the fire with the finality of someone who considered the conversation concluded and moved to the far end of the room, which was 8 feet from any other point, and began attending to a length of harness leather that probably did not urgently require attention at that particular moment. She took the bed. The cabin, she was learning, contained considerable information about its occupant if you were willing to read it. The shelves were organized by function in a way that made sense only if you had been doing everything alone for a long time and had stopped leaving room in any system for another person's logic. The tools were maintained past the point that usefulness strictly required. The firewood stacked outside the door, which she had observed on the walk-in, was stacked with a precision that suggested the stacking itself was something the stacker found worthwhile rather than merely necessary. A person who stacks firewood like that is telling you something. It takes her a while to work out what. He made supper without asking if she was hungry, which told her one thing about him. He placed her portion at the near end of the table and retreated to the far end to eat his own, which told her another. He ate standing at that end of the table, very tall, very contained, apparently finding something in the middle distance of the cabin wall to occupy his attention. She ate and watched him from across the 12 feet of available distance and tried to work out what exactly she was dealing with. He was not unfriendly. He was not cold. He was, she concluded after some observation, simply terrified, in the specific contained way of a person who is managing a significant fear with everything available and hoping nobody notices the management. She had seen this quality before in very large dogs that had been startled by something small. She found it considerably more interesting than alarming. After supper, he washed both sets of dishes before she could get up to do her own. Then he arranged himself on the floor between the wood stove and the door with a single wool blanket and an expression of enormous and apparently load-bearing dignity. She looked at him. She looked at the floor, which was bare plank and showed no evidence of ever having been comfortable. She said, "You cannot sleep on that." He said, "I'm fine." He said it in the tone of a man who has made a decision and would prefer not to revisit it. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the door, which the wind was now discussing with some intensity. She lay down on the bed and listened to the storm explain itself to the mountains. The fire needed another log by midnight. He got up and added one quietly in the dark. This was good. But what was not good was the temperature of the room, which had been expressing its opinion about a fire that was not being well attended, and the sound of his breathing on the floor, which had the specific quality of a man whose body was having a more direct relationship with the cold than his pride was willing to formally acknowledge. She said to the ceiling, "How much firewood do we have left?" A pause. Then, "Enough for a few hours." She lay still and thought about this. The storm had not stopped. The temperature had not stopped dropping. The blanket on the floor was a single wool blanket on a November night in Montana, and the man under it was on bare plank, and his breathing had the held quality of someone who has decided that the discomfort is not worth mentioning, because mentioning it would require admitting that the situation is what it obviously is. She said, "Arthur." A short pause. "What?" She said, "If you are found frozen to your own floor in the morning, I will feel directly responsible for it, and I would prefer not to." Silence. She said, "We have one blanket. The fire has a few hours of wood. Outside is doing what outside is doing. Pride is going to get you killed." A longer silence. She heard him breathe in through his nose. She heard him breathe out. She said, "We must share the blanket." She heard the silence that followed that sentence, which was a different kind of silence from the ones before it. The silence of a man working through every available alternative to the proposed situation and finding that none of them held up under honest examination. He said very quietly, "That wouldn't be appropriate." She said, "You freezing to the floor is also not appropriate. Get in the bed, Arthur." A pause, this one shorter. He got in the bed. He arranged himself on the far edge of the mattress with the careful rigidity of a man determined to occupy the absolute minimum amount of shared space permitted by the laws of physics. He was facing the wall. He was not touching her in any way, though the bed was not large, and the maintenance of this required what appeared to be active and ongoing structural attention. She pulled the blanket over both of them. The wind pushed against the cabin walls. The fire settled. Outside, the storm made its case to the mountains. For a long time, neither of them said anything. She could feel the warmth of him through the blanket, the specific warmth of a very large person who has been cold too long and is now incrementally and apparently without conscious awareness becoming less rigid. She could feel the tension of him, the enormous careful effort of a man maintaining distance through pure intention, because the physical distance available was insufficient for the distance he was attempting. Then she could feel, very gradually, that effort begin to cost more than he had to spend on it, and he let it down. She said to the ceiling, "Where did you come from?" He did not answer immediately. She was learning that his pauses were not unfriendliness. They were the natural cadence of a person who had been the only one asking and answering their own questions for long enough that a question from outside required more assembling than it used to. He said, still facing the wall, "Nebraska." She said, "What brought you this far north?" Another pause. Then, "I had a farm in Nebraska." He stopped, started again. "I lost it," she said. "I'm sorry." He said, "My wife left the same year." He said it with the flatness of a fact that has been held long enough to lose most of its edges. She was right too. I wasn't easy to be around in those years. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about asking the next question and decided she had not yet been invited to. She said, "My father lost a farm too in Missouri. The bank took it when I was 12. He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "He didn't take it the way you might expect. He said the land was still there, just under different management. He thought that was funny." She heard something in the dark beside her that might, by a very charitable interpretation, have been the very beginning of a laugh that had not quite made it out. The almost laugh of a person who has been out of practice with the motion. She said, "What made you come this far up?" He said after a moment, "I wanted to be somewhere I was unlikely to cause anyone any trouble." She thought about this. "And have you?" He said, "No." She said, "Is that what you wanted?" A longer pause than any of the ones before it. The fire shifted in the stove. The storm found a new argument with the eaves. He said, "I thought it was." Neither of them said anything for a while after that. Then she said, "I think the things we run from and the things we run toward look more similar than we expect when we are running." He turned his head slightly, not toward her, just less away from her than it had been. He said, "What are you running toward?" She said, My sister's homestead, Billings. He said, "That isn't what I meant." She said, "I know." She looked at the ceiling. A version of a life with more room in it than the one I had. I had a good life. It was just very arranged. Everyone around me was very certain about what it was supposed to look like. He said, "And what do you want it to look like?" She thought about this. Less certain, more honest, more room for the unexpected. He said very quietly, "You picked an unusual night for it." She laughed, an actual clear laugh, and she felt him go entirely still beside her with the specific stillness of a man who has just heard something directed at something he said that he did not know he still had the ability to produce. She said, "I did." He was quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet from what had come before. The quiet of someone who is thinking rather than the quiet of someone who is managing. He said, "In Nebraska before the farm, I used to talk a lot." A pause. "My wife said I talked enough for 3 men." She said, "What happened?" He said, "I stopped having things I wanted to say, or I stopped believing anyone wanted to hear them." He considered this. "Both, I think, at different times." She said, "I'm listening now." Another long pause. He said, "I know." He said it differently from the way he had said anything else that night. That's the strange part. She woke at dawn to a storm that had finished its argument and departed. The light coming through the single window was the particular quality of light after heavy snowfall, bright and without apology. The fire had burned down, but the room was not cold. Arthur was not in the bed. He was at the wood stove making coffee, moving through the kitchen end of the room with the quiet competence of a man in his own space. He had his back to her. He was not facing the wall. She sat up. He heard her and turned. And for the first time since she had materialized out of the snowdrift in front of him, he looked at her directly for longer than 2 seconds. He did not look away. He said, "Coffee." She said, "Please." He poured 2 cups and brought one to the near end of the table and sat down with his own. Not the far end, the middle. She got up and came to the table and sat across from him, and they drank their coffee while the new snowlight came through the window, and the cabin had a different quality to it than it had the night before, not smaller. Differently arranged. The space between the 2 chairs considerably less than it had been when she walked in. He said, "The road will be passable by midday. I can get you to the stage line." She said, "Thank you." He looked at the coffee cup. "What you said last night about a life with more room in it." She waited. He said, "I think I know what you mean." She said, "I thought you might." He took her to the stage line that afternoon in a wagon through snow that was deep but passable. When they arrived, she thanked him properly, and he said she was welcome, and looked at her directly while he said it, which she noted as different from the day before in a way she did not yet have precise language for. He handed her a piece of paper before she climbed up to the stage. Directions to his cabin, written in a large, careful hand with the deliberateness of someone writing something they have thought about. He said nothing about why he was giving it to her. She took it and put it in her bag. She wrote to him from her sister's homestead in Billings 3 weeks after she arrived. It was not a long letter. It described the valley and the homestead and a specific observation about the light over the mountains in the morning that she had been saving because she thought he would understand what she meant by it. He wrote back. His letter was longer than she expected. Arthur Briggs came down from Crow Creek Pass the following spring and did not go back to it. He filed a homestead claim in the valley outside Billings on land close enough to her sister's property to make neighborliness a reasonable arrangement and far enough away to make it a choice rather than a proximity. They were married in the summer of 1885 in a small ceremony. Clara wore the dress she had been wearing the day the stagecoach went over, which had been cleaned and mended, and had, she said, earned the occasion. Arthur became, over the years that followed, the kind of man who talks, not excessively. Not in the way of people who have forgotten how to be quiet and talk to fill the space. In the way of someone who has remembered that talking to the right person is not a diminishment of solitude, but a different and complementary thing. He told her once, some years into their marriage, that the night of the storm was the first time he had talked to anyone, really talked to anyone, in over 4 years. She said, "What changed?" He said, "You were asking questions that actually wanted answers." She looked at him, and the blanket helped. He considered this with the gravity he brought to everything worth considering. The blanket helped, he agreed. The cabin on Crow Creek Pass is still standing. The single wool blanket is not there anymore. It kept better company elsewhere.